Of all the categories I expected to talk about in these videos, who's the most introverted assassin was certainly not one of them. But one of the top comments in my last video I did this for requested this, and a lot of you guys really seem to like the idea, so here we are. If you're unfamiliar with this series of mine, well, first of all, there's an entire playlist of these videos. This series has been going on for like over 2 years now. But basically what I do is I take the assassins of the series and compare them on numerous categories to determine which assassin protagonist of the series is the best at that particular subject. In this case, we're talking about who's the most introverted, so this should be interesting. Where are all my fellow introverts at? But I'm only talking about the characters who were protagonists of the series and were actual assassins, so if you're wondering why I don't include Alexios, Cassandra, or Eivor, that's why. I'm still considering doing one of these videos for all the protagonists in the series, if you guys are still interested in that. And the reason I don't include Shay in these videos is because I do these for the Templars of the series as well, and since he was a Templar far longer than he ever was an assassin, I include him in those instead. But of all the topics I've covered in this series, this one is definitely going to be a bit different. We're going to look into a lot of these assassins' personality traits, who they interact with, and how social they are. I'd say most assassins in this series are probably introverts. I mean, what better career for an introvert than being a mysterious assassin wearing a hood? But there are definitely still some extroverts. So naturally, we're going to start with Altair. Altair is definitely an introvert. Part of that has to do with how he was raised. He was essentially raised as an assassin, and the life of the Creed is the only one he had ever known. You can see numerous times throughout AC1, he doesn't really get along with a lot of the other assassins and prefers to be a lone wolf. In fact, at first, he seems to believe that his brothers are holding him back. Even in Revelations, when Altair took over as mentor, you can tell he's still the type of person who keeps more to himself. He does have a family and his close circle, but he's not exactly a social butterfly like someone like Ezio, for example. If his reaction to seeing a woman was any indication,
I sense you expected someone else.
What sorcery is this?
Altair doesn't really socialize much, but he's an assassin, he doesn't really need to. I believe Altair is a natural introvert, and he lived a mostly isolated life due to his circumstances being a lifelong member of the Brotherhood. So he certainly has a strong case for the most introverted assassin. Next up is the near polar opposite. Ezio is far more extroverted. He's more social and outgoing compared to someone like Altair. I mean, the amount of women he pulls alone. Ezio also makes a legion of friends throughout his adventures. Very powerful and influential friends, I might add, like Leonardo da Vinci and Suleiman. The guy just has the natural charisma and talent for making social connections. In a lot of cases, those social skills really come in clutch for Ezio as well. I will say though that Ezio probably became a little more introverted as he got older. He became wiser and more observant and reflective, and with the end of Revelations continuing into Embers, he chooses to live a more isolated life with just his family. He acts very different from that young Ezio of Assassin's Creed 2. With all that said, he's still probably one of the more extroverted assassins of the series though. Connor, on the other hand, is a very different story. Connor is a natural introvert. He's the opposite of Ezio in so many ways. In fact, that's why some people criticized him when AC3 first came out. They were so used to this lovable, charming Italian that the change to a more brooding, introverted killer gave them whiplash, which I think is such a silly criticism. Like real life, not every person is an Ezio, and as an introvert myself, I could definitely relate to that element of Connor more. But the other thing to consider with Connor is that he's constantly feeling like an outsider in AC3. He was raised in a native village with his tribe. He wasn't raised in an environment like Boston or New York, which is why he seems like a fish out of water when he first arrives in those cities. He's not used to interacting with those kinds of people, and on top of that, many of them shun and disrespect him, which is why Connor can come off as so hostile and defensive whenever speaking with a stranger. It's almost like a defense mechanism. And a little detail I love with Connor's interactions with the colonists that I noticed when I did that When I Die the Video Ends is that these people are constantly touching Connor, putting a hand on his shoulder or whatever it may be, and he does not like it one bit. I find that so funny because it's so relatable to me, and definitely the quality of an introvert who likes his personal space.
Allow me to... You and I.
Do not touch Connor, man. He does not like that.
Rouse the... No time for dawdling, my friend.
This guy does not learn his lesson. I'm curious if something like that is even scripted, or if it's something Noah Watts improvised in the mocap suit. And then on top of being more of a lone wolf and an outsider, the brotherhood Connor is a part of is only him and Achilles. He spent years being trained by solely Achilles at that isolated homestead out in the woods, with little other human interaction. I haven't even brought up the trauma he probably has watching his mother die as a child, and yet people wonder why he can't be more charming and outgoing like Ezio. Sure, Ezio watched his family die too, but he was also far older than Connor was when it happened. There's so many factors that go into why Connor is the way he is, and I definitely think he should be considered for the most introverted assassin of the series. Aveline is kind of a difficult one to discuss. She was separated from her mother when she was young and taken into a wealthy family where she was socialized and learned the proper etiquette for those more fancy social events. But at the same time, similar to Connor, she was always still an outsider. Perhaps she's not quite as introverted as Connor and was raised in a more sociable environment, but she's not exactly the outgoing type like an Ezio either. Edward, similar to Ezio, is definitely an extrovert. He's very good at communicating and charming people, which can be useful when trying to manipulate people like he did so easily with Steed Bonnet in Black Flag's prologue. Edward had always been one to live loudly, and he was a pirate, so it only made sense. Edward, for a while there, essentially did whatever he wanted and was not afraid to speak his mind. I wouldn't say he was quite as friendly as Ezio, because outside of his close friends, Edward could be quite hostile, but he was never shy. Not to mention he was captain of the Jackdaw and one of the leaders of the pirates in Nassau. Edward is certainly not the most introverted assassin. But what about his quartermaster and close friend, Adewale? Adewale is certainly more reserved and introverted than Edward, though I still wouldn't really consider him as introverted as, say, Connor or Altair, for example. But in a similar way to Connor, Adewale wasn't born into the same situation as Edward or various other characters from Black Flag. He wasn't treated with respect anywhere except for the Jackdaw, which is why he was able to build such a close bond with Edward and the crew. And in Freedom Cry, you can see many examples of him taking the initiative and a leadership role as he tries to liberate the slaves of Haiti. To me, I do think Adewale is more introverted than extroverted, but he's not the most introverted assassin of the series. Arno's another difficult one to pin down exactly. He has many qualities of both an introvert and extrovert, especially when you consider his childhood, losing his father and being raised by the De La Serres, but there's still plenty of examples throughout Unity of him being a more warm and charming person who often relies on his wit. He's not exactly the lone wolf type like Connor and Altair. He values building bonds with people. So for Arno, I'd say he probably leans more towards being an extrovert, but it's not like he has a large social circle either. It still seems like he likes to keep a small circle around him, but regardless of what category he falls under exactly, he's not the most introverted assassin. As for Jacob, some people might initially think because of his personality he's an extrovert, but I actually think he's got some traits of an introvert as well. Yes, he can appear loud, outgoing, impulsive, and reckless, but he really only has one person he can truly talk to. Like, outside of his sister Evie, he doesn't really seem to be close to anyone else. Jacob's another character that had just never really fit in and is constantly misunderstood. I suppose he has traits of both, both because he can be outspoken but also more reserved at times. I feel like most people would take one look at him and think immediately he's an extrovert because of how he acts, but I think there's a bit more to it than that. Now, Evie is definitely an introvert. She's more reserved and insightful. She thinks things through before speaking out, unlike Jacob, who often has no filter, and there's plenty of examples where Evie can appear more timid, like around Henry, for example. She also spends lots of time reading books and researching. It's pretty obvious she's an introvert, but whether she's the most introverted, I don't know. Bayek, I believe, is an extrovert. He's a very warm and genuine person who often goes out of his way to communicate with people and help them out, which so happens to perfectly suit his job as a Medjay. Sure, you get to see a lot of moments of rage with Bayek, but you also get to see a lot of his warmth as well. How he treats children in particular is always really heartwarming to see. He's able to create strong bonds with people throughout his journey, similar to Ezio, and he's a very caring and compassionate person. Maybe sometimes a little too much for his own good, so Bayek is far from the most introverted. Alright, so that brings us to the moment of truth. Of all the protagonists of the series, I've narrowed down the most introverted to Altair, Connor, and Evie. All three definitely have their reasons and justifications for why they could be the most introverted, but I personally believe the most introverted assassin of the series is Connor Kenway. I gave a multitude of reasons already for why I believe that is the case, but a lot of it comes down to his entire scenario and the circumstances of how he was raised. He also happens to be a more quiet, reflective person, even though he can be very warm and observant of people, especially those in need. But he can also come off as difficult or hostile to those he doesn't know. And for the love of God, don't just randomly touch him. You'll probably lose your hand. But as always, this is just my opinion. Feel free to let me know down in the comments who you feel the most introverted assassin is and why. And let me know what category you want to see next for this series. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and considered subscribing to the channel if you're new. And other than that, thanks for watching and have a great rest of your day, assassins.